one of the topics that we'll cover in Module 4 will be the bones and the skeletal tissues. Here we'll look more closely at what bones are composed of, as well as the general features of all bones within the skeleton. So we will study bone from two perspectives. The first is as a tissue, so that is, we will examine the cells and the extracellular matrix of bony tissues. And the second perspective is that we will examine the bones of the skeleton as a whole, because whole bones are composed not only of bony tissue, but they also have structures that are associated with them, such as other connective tissues, blood vessels, and nerves. So we'll begin with the functions of the bones and then the skeleton as a whole, and then we'll examine more closely bony tissue. So at birth, we have approximately 270 bones, and as an adult, we have around 206 bones. So where is it that these 64 bones go to? And it turns out that as we age, the bones will fuse together. So that is, several adjacent or nearby bones will fuse together into a single piece of bone. So bones provide, of course, the internal supportive framework for the body, and they also protect the soft, delicate organs. For example, the brain, the lungs, and the heart are all structures that are supported or protected in some way by bone. They also serve as anchorage for skeletal muscles, so that when the skeletal muscles contract, they will produce movement of the skeleton and movement of our body. Bones also store calcium minerals, such as calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. So in a way, the bones act as a bank in which deposits and withdrawals of these calcium minerals can occur regularly. The bones also have tissue in them that produces all of the blood cells. And this is called red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is found within some of the bones, and it functions to produce the blood cells in a process called hematopoiesis. The bones also store adipose tissue within a material called the yellow bone marrow. So let's take a more in-depth look at the bony tissues. So recall that bone is a connective tissue, and as such, it contains an extracellular matrix in addition to its cells. And for a moment here, we'll focus primarily on the extracellular matrix. So there are two types of bony tissue that we will encounter within the skeleton. We have spongy bone and we have compact bone. So as shown here, bones are not solid structures. Their interior is usually filled with a honeycomb-like bone tissue that's called spongy bone, which is a lightweight but supportive type of bone. Spongy bone is composed or made of small needle-like pieces that are called trabeculae. Typically, in living bones and bone tissue, we see that red marrow or yellow marrow will fill the spaces between spongy bone, and we'll also see that there are blood vessels in here as well. The outer surfaces of bone is a solid and smooth structure and material because of the presence of a very dense type of bone called compact bone. So recall from Module 3 that compact bone is arranged into these ring-like structures called osteons, and the compact bone composes the superficial surface of all of the bones in our skeleton. So in compact bone, the osteons are composed of these ring-like pillars of bone tissue that are called lamellae. At the middle of the osteon is a channel called the central canal where blood vessels and nerves are housed. The blood vessels will nourish the tissues of the osteon and also the cells that are associated with the osteon, as we'll see in a moment. So the central canal serves the osteon that it's associated with. Bone cells, called osteocytes, are located in small pit-like holes at the edges of the lamella, and these small pit-like holes are called lacuna. The osteocytes are cells that help to maintain the calcium and phosphorus minerals that are in the extracellular matrix of the bone tissue. So here's a few different perspectives of the central canal that shows the location of the nerves and the blood vessels in this structure, as well as the lamellae, which are the ring-like pillars of bone in the osteon. The pits called lacunae, where the osteocytes are housed, are much more visible particularly in the image on the upper left. So adjacent central canals of adjacent osteons are connected by perpendicular channels called perforating canals. And these perforating canals essentially give a place for the blood vessels and nerves to kind of wind their way through the bone and make their way to all parts of the bone and bone tissue. So this diagram gives us also a much better view of the pillar-like structures of the lamellae. So notice that the lamellae, even though they look like rings from the tissue slides that we examined before, are actually ring-like pillars that are nested within one another in the osteon. So the lamellae of the osteons are typically oriented parallel with the force of body weight, and so in that way they act as weight-bearing pillars of the bony tissue, so much like the pillars of buildings are weight-bearing. So minerals like calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate are not the only material that make up the lamellae. The lamellae also contain collagen fibers within them. And we see that the collagen fibers run in different directions, that is, they run in the opposite direction in adjacent lamellae. And this helps to make the entire osteon resistant to twisting in any direction, either in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction. So remember that bones are really quite strong in the weight-bearing compression forces that we usually subject them to, because they're really tasked with carrying our body weight. But they are relatively weak in the twisting or the tension forces. So typically when bones break, it is because they have experienced a twisting force or a tension force. The small fibers that you see extending out of the lacuna are not actually fibers at all. It turns out that they're small channels that connect to the adjacent lacuna, and these channels are called the canaliculi. It turns out that osteocytes actually have these small kind of bristle-like extensions that function to connect adjacent osteocytes within the osteon. So in reality, the canaliculi are the small channels through the compact bone tissue that allow for these little bristle-like extensions to connect adjacent osteocytes. So these extensions allow the osteocytes to connect and act like a small network. They share nutrients and aid in the removal of waste, and they share all of that material with the blood that's in the central canal. So that's where they're getting the nutrients from, the blood in the central canal, and they're also removing wastes by moving those wastes to the blood vessels in the central canal. The channels will help connect all of the osteocytes in a particular osteon to that central canal. So those small cellular extensions that we just saw on the osteocytes contain gap junctions. And recall that gap junctions allow materials to pass from the interior of one cell to the interior of an adjacent cell. In this case, the adjacent cells that we're discussing are the osteocytes in the compact bone. Now recall that gap junctions are protein tunnels, and they're essentially tunnel-like passageways that connect to the interior of two nearby cells. So last we'll see that bone has two chemical components, or it's composed of two different types of materials. We have an inorganic component and an organic component. And here the term inorganic refers to the material in the bone tissue that is not cells and is not proteins. So meanwhile, the organic components are referring to the cells, like the osteocytes that we just saw, and the proteins of bone tissue, like the collagen fibers. The inorganic components compose roughly 65% of the mass of bone tissue, so that is, they are the majority. These are the minerals like the calcium carbonate and the calcium phosphate, which we discussed earlier. These minerals give the bones their toughness as well as their ability to resist compression and carry body weight. The inorganic components, on the other hand, compose the remaining 35% of the mass of bone tissue. These materials are the things like the collagen fibers that help the bone tissue to resist tension, and also the bone cells, such as the osteocytes that we had just seen in the images and structures of compact bone.